The word left Jedediah Keating's mouth before he could call it back, rough and raw as the Wyoming wind that tore across the Sweetwater Valley that October evening in 1882. He had not planned to say it. He had not planned any of what happened in those final breathless seconds when Ada Blackwell turned from him with her worn leather traveling bag in her hand and started walking toward the gate of Keating Ranch, the same gate she had ridden through 6 weeks ago like a woman who had nowhere left to run. "Stay," he said, just that one word, and the weight of it knocked the air from his own chest. Ada stopped walking. Her back was to him, her dark hair loose from its pins after the argument that had shaken the rafters of his ranch house, her shoulders set with all the rigid, furious pride of a woman who had learned early in life that softness was the thing that got you destroyed. The evening light caught the copper threads in her hair and turned them to fire, and Jedediah stood on his porch with his hat in both hands and his heart somewhere between his throat and the dust at his boots, watching her. She said nothing. She did not leave. The silence between them stretched out across the yard, across the 6 weeks of careful distance and hidden truths and moments they had each pretended not to notice. And Jedediah Keating, who had survived 2 cattle drives, a range war, and the brutal winter of 1878, found that a woman standing very still in his gateway was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed, because he did not know what her silence meant. He did not know if it meant yes, or if it meant that she was simply gathering the last of her strength before she stepped through that gate and disappeared from his life the way everyone he had ever loved had disappeared. He had asked her to stay on his land. She had said nothing, but she had not left. And so we go back, because a moment like that one does not exist on its own. It is built, piece by piece, from everything that came before it. 6 weeks earlier, in the first week of September of that same year, Ada Blackwell arrived at the Keating Ranch in the back of Elias Pruitt's mail wagon, which was not the most dignified way to arrive anywhere, but Ada had long since made her peace with indignity. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, and traveling under circumstances she had told no one about in full detail. She carried one leather bag, a small wooden box that she kept locked at all times, and a letter of introduction from a man named Reverend Holt of Cheyenne, which she had written herself. That last fact was the beginning of the secret she carried, and the thing that would nearly destroy everything. Pruitt dropped her at the gate and did not wait. He had a schedule to keep and he was already behind, and besides, there was something about the woman that made him uneasy in a way he could not name. She was too still, too watchful. Women who watched that carefully were usually watching for something specific, and Pruitt had enough trouble of his own. Ada stood at the gate and looked at the ranch spread before her. It was substantial, she could see that immediately. The main house was 2 stories of weathered pine with a wide porch that wrapped around both the front and the side. There were 3 outbuildings she could identify, a bunkhouse, what appeared to be a tack shed, and a newer structure she thought might be a smokehouse. The cattle were distant shapes in the lower pasture, but there were many of them, 100 at least, she guessed, maybe closer to 200. The land itself stretched away to the east where the Rattlesnake Hills darkened the horizon, and to the north where a line of cottonwoods marked the creek that she knew, from what she had read in the letter she had stolen, was called Keating Creek after the family that had settled it. Jedediah Keating came out of the barn. He was not what she expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. She had read his letter twice, the one he had sent to the matrimonial agency in Cheyenne, the agency where Ada had spent 3 weeks working as a clerk before things went wrong in ways she had not anticipated. He was 32. He owned the ranch free and clear. He wanted a capable woman, not a delicate one. Those were the words he had used, not a delicate one. She had liked him for that before she had ever seen his face. His face, it turned out, was worth considering. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the particular leanness of a man who worked hard and forgot to eat. His face was sun-dark and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the hills behind the ranch, and his eyes, even at this distance, were some light color that caught the September sun and held it. He walked the way working men walked in that country, with a kind of ground-eating deliberateness that suggested he always knew where he was going and why. He stopped about 10 feet from the gate and looked at her. She looked back at him. "You the woman from the agency," he said. "I am," Ada said, which was true enough, if not quite in the way he meant it. "Where is your letter of introduction?" She produced it from the inside of her traveling coat. She had forged Reverend Holt's signature with considerable care, having spent 2 evenings practicing it from the samples she had seen during her weeks as a clerk. She was not proud of this. But she was alive, which was more than she would have been if she had stayed in Cheyenne and let Harlan Cruz catch up with her. Jedediah read the letter. He read it slowly and carefully, which told her he was a man who did not skim things, who paid attention to details. This worried her slightly. She kept her face arranged in the mild, attentive expression she had been practicing. "It says here you have experience with household management and some with livestock," he said. "I do," Ada said. "My family kept a working farm until I was 19. I know how to run a kitchen, preserve food, keep accounts, and I am not afraid of early mornings or hard weather." All of that was true. The farm had been in Missouri, and it had been a hard one, and Ada had grown up knowing what it meant to be useful before sentiment. Jedediah looked at her for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable. She met his gaze without flinching, which was, she would learn later, the thing that decided it for him. "All right, miss," he glanced at the letter. "Miss Blackwell, I will show you the house. We can discuss the terms of the arrangement after supper." The arrangement. That was what he called it in the letter, too. Not a marriage, exactly. An arrangement between 2 practical people who understood what frontier life required. He would provide shelter, land, and a share of the ranch's income. She would provide household management and the general partnership of a capable woman. They would marry at the end of a trial period of 6 weeks, if both parties were still agreeable. He had written that last part with such careful neutrality that Ada, reading it in the agency office 3 weeks ago, had felt something unexpectedly human stir in her chest. He did not want to trap anyone. He was offering a door that could be walked back through. She had not planned to use the arrangement for what she was using it for. She had not planned any of this. She had planned to be a respectable agency clerk in Cheyenne and slowly, carefully rebuild the kind of life that Harlan Cruz had taken from her when he had burned her name through every employment house in the territory with his lies. But Cruz had found her faster than she expected, and she had seen his man Doyle watching the agency from across the street 2 days running, and she had done what she always did when danger closed in. She moved. She took the file on Keating Ranch because it was the most recent, the most substantial, and the furthest from Cheyenne without leaving Wyoming territory. She took the forms and the letter, and she sat in her rented room above the butcher shop, and she wrote herself into the arrangement with the careful, practiced penmanship she had used to write her way through worse situations than this one. She told herself it was temporary. She would stay 6 weeks, long enough for Cruz to lose the scent, and then she would quietly dissolve the arrangement and move on. She would not hurt Jedediah Keating. She would be useful, as agreed. She would be honest about everything except the one thing she could not afford to be honest about. She had not anticipated that the ranch would be so beautiful. She had not anticipated Jedediah. The house was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Clean and spare and smelling of pine resin and wood smoke, with a kitchen that had real shelving and a cast iron stove that was better than anything she had used since Missouri. There were 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. An older man named Walt Greer, who had been with the ranch since Jedediah's father's time. A young Mexican man named Refugio Salinas, who was 19 and very serious. And a wiry, sun-leathered man called Pitch, who had some name that nobody ever used. They were introduced to her at supper with the careful restraint of men who had been warned to be decent. Jedediah sat at the head of the table. Ada sat at the other end. The food was simple, beans and salt pork and cornbread, and it was edible but only barely, and Ada understood immediately what she could contribute. After supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Jedediah poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across the table. "You should know what you are entering into," he said. "I read the letter carefully," Ada said. "The letter doesn't tell you everything." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. He had large, scarred hands, a rancher's hands, and he looked down at them for a moment as if deciding something. "This is a working ranch, not a house in town. The winters here are hard. The work is consistent and sometimes it's rough. I have 1,200 acres, most of it running cattle, some of it hay ground. I employ 3 men year-round and sometimes more during the drives. What I need is a woman who can keep this house, keep accounts because Walt can't read well and I'm out too much to do it myself, and who won't come apart when things get difficult." "I don't come apart," Ada said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't think you do. You should also know something," Ada said, because she had decided on the wagon ride from town that honesty, in degrees, was her best protection. "I'm not the kind of woman who submits to a situation without understanding it fully. I will ask questions. I will tell you when I think something is being done wrong. I will not be an ornament." Something shifted in Jedediah's expression. It was small, barely visible, but she caught it. Something that might, with a great deal of charitable interpretation, have been called the beginning of respect. "Good," he said. "I've had enough ornaments. My mother was an ornament. She left in the 3rd winter." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact, the way you state the year of a drought. Ada filed it away carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We understand the arrangement," he said, which was not quite the same thing, and they both knew it. She stayed in the room at the top of the stairs, the guest room that had not been used in some time if the dust was any indication. She beat the mattress clean and remade the bed and set her locked wooden box on the shelf where she could see it from where she lay. Inside the box were the only things in the world that were hers without question, a daguerreotype of her mother. $15 in coin that she had earned honestly. A letter that Harlan Cruz had written to someone about her, intercepted by a woman in his household who had seen enough of what he did to women, and had sent it to Ada as a warning. That letter was her leverage. It was the thing that kept her alive, the knowledge that she had proof of what Cruz had done, not just to her but to others, and that if he had her killed, she had arranged for that letter to find its way to the territorial marshal's office. She had told this to the one person in Cheyenne she trusted, a laundress named Mrs. Ortega, who kept the envelope in her Bible and would send it if Ada disappeared. It was not a comfortable life, being the kind of woman who had to make those arrangements. But Ada Blackwell had not been comfortable since she was 19 years old, and her father had introduced her to his business associate Harlan Cruz at a dinner in Kansas City, and Cruz had looked at her with the particular calculating attention of a man who sees something he intends to acquire. She had not been acquired, but the attempt had cost her everything she had started with. She lay in the dark on Jedediah Keating's clean spare mattress and looked at the ceiling and told herself this was temporary. 6 weeks. She would be useful, she would be quiet, and she would leave before anything became complicated. She was wrong about all of it except the useful part. The first week was professional and careful. Ada took over the kitchen with brisk competence, and the hands ate better immediately, which earned her a kind of shy, grateful respect from Refugio, who had apparently been the one doing most of the cooking before her arrival and had hated every moment of it. Walt Greer watched her with the assessing wariness of a man who had seen people come and go on this ranch, and had his doubts about the permanence of any of them. He was not unkind, just careful, the same way the land was careful, offering nothing until it was earned. Jedediah was at the house for meals and for the evenings, when he sat at the desk in the small room off the parlor and went through the accounts. On the 3rd evening, Ada came to the doorway of that room and told him she had found 2 errors in the September ledger and offered to show him where. He turned in his chair and looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, and then said, "Show me." She showed him. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Can you do the accounts?" "I can," she said. "Then do them," he said, not gratefully, not begrudgingly. Simply as a fact established, a thing decided. She found she respected that. She was tired of men who performed gratitude they did not feel or who bristled at competence as though it were an accusation. She began keeping the accounts. In the second week, the relationship between them took a step sideways into something she had not planned for. It started with the horses. There were 7 horses on the ranch, 3 working horses, Jedediah's own sorrel named Cedar, and 3 others of varying quality that were used for different purposes. Ada, going out early one morning to see about the garden that was being strangled by some kind of blight, passed the corral and stopped. Jedediah was working with a young gray mare that she had not seen before. He was in the corral without his hat, which somehow made him look different, younger or more human or both, and he was doing something she had only seen a handful of times, working the horse in circles with nothing but his posture and the movement of the long rope he held, reading the mare's body the way you read a book, understanding something that was not being said in words. She stood at the fence and watched without meaning to. He noticed her after about 10 minutes, the way she noticed things, quietly and without making a fuss about it. He brought the mare to a stop and walked over to where Ada stood. "New," Ada said. "Came in yesterday. Belongs to a man who owed me a debt and couldn't pay it any other way. She's got some history I need to work out of her." "What kind of history?" He looked at the mare for a moment. "Someone used a crop on her face," he said flatly. "She's terrified of anything coming toward her head." Ada felt the sharp, familiar tug of recognition that she always felt at cruelty. "How do you fix that?" she asked. "Slowly," he said. "You don't fix it exactly. You teach her that the world can also be gentle, and you give her enough time with the gentle version that it starts to outweigh the memory of the other kind." Ada said nothing. She was aware that he was not only talking about the horse. She was not sure he was aware of that. She went back to the garden, but she thought about what he had said for the rest of the morning. The third week brought the first real crisis, and it had nothing to do with Ada's secrets. One of the cattle, a yearling, had wandered into the creek bed in the night and broken a leg in the rocks. By the time it was discovered, there was nothing to be done for the animal, and Jedediah dealt with it in the early morning with the grim, quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing hard things since childhood. But he came back to the house after with mud on his boots and something set and heavy in his face, and when Ada set breakfast in front of him, he looked at it for a moment and then pushed back from the table and stood with his back to her, looking out the window. "Sit down and eat," Ada said. He turned slightly surprised. "You can be unhappy about it later," she said. "Right now the food is hot." He sat down, he ate, and after a moment something in his jaw unclenched. "I hate losing animals," he said. "Most people who work with them do," she said. "The ones who don't are worse at the work." He looked at her across the table with that unreadable expression he sometimes wore, the one she was slowly learning to read by its particular quality of stillness. "Where did you work before this?" he asked. This was the territory she had to be careful about. "A farm in Missouri until I was 19, she said, which was true. "Then I spent some years in different places, different kinds of work. I was in Cheyenne most recently. All true in the factual sense." She watched his face to see if he would press further. He did not press. He filed it away the way she had noticed he did with everything, quietly and without fanfare, to be considered later. But she knew later would come. In the fourth week, something shifted between them without either of them doing anything deliberate to cause it. It happened in the evenings, which had become the most dangerous time, Ada felt, because the evenings were when the work was done, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet and there was nothing to do but be two people sharing a space. They had developed a habit, not discussed, not agreed upon, simply evolved over the course of the previous weeks, of sitting in the parlor after supper. Jedediah read. He had a shelf of books that surprised her when she first noticed it. Not the practical books she expected, but novels and histories, and a worn copy of Milton that looked like it had been read many times. Ada did the accounts or mended things or sometimes simply sat, which was a thing she had not done in years because sitting still felt dangerous when you were running. But here, in this house, the stillness had started to feel different. On a Tuesday evening in the fourth week, she was sitting with the account ledger open in front of her and not looking at it, looking instead at the window and the early dark outside it. And Jedediah looked up from his book and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Missouri," she said, which was not a lie. She had been thinking about her mother who had died when Ada was 17, and about the particular quality of autumn light in Missouri that was different from the autumn light in Wyoming, fuller and more golden somehow, less sharp. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "I miss who I was there," she said. "Not the place exactly." He was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Who were you there?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that attentive stillness of his, the book set down, the question genuine. It was the kind of attention that was difficult to lie to, not because it was suspicious, but because it was honest, and honesty has a way of demanding its own kind. "Someone who thought the world was mostly what it appeared to be," she said. "And then it wasn't," he said. "And then it wasn't." He nodded. He picked up his book again, but he didn't read it immediately. And in the silence that followed, Ada felt the strange, terrifying sensation of having been understood without having explained anything. She picked up the ledger and pretended to be very busy with the numbers. The fifth week was when everything began to unravel, and it was, as dangerous things often are, entirely her fault. She had been in Jedediah's employ for just over 4 weeks when Elias Pruitt's mail wagon came again, and this time it brought a letter addressed to Jedediah from an associate in Cheyenne. The letter was about business, cattle prices, and the spring drive schedules, and it was placed on the desk in the study, and Jedediah read it that evening. Ada would not have thought anything of it except that, when Jedediah came to supper that evening, something in his expression was different. He was thoughtful in a way that had an edge to it, a sharpness that she recognized as the look of a man who had encountered a problem he was trying to work out. She thought nothing of it. She should have thought everything of it. 2 days later, she was in the kitchen when she heard Jedediah and Walt Greer talking in the yard. The window was open because the day was warm and she was putting up the last of the fall preserves, and their voices carried in. "You looked into it," Jedediah was saying. "Best I could," Walt said. He was quiet for a moment. "The agency in Cheyenne. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Caldwell, she said she never sent anyone out to Keating Ranch. Said she didn't have a file on you." The jar in Ada's hands went very still. "She didn't match the letter either," Jedediah said. "The handwriting." "I noticed that too," Walt said. "The letter of introduction doesn't match the forms in the file, different hand." Ada set the jar down very carefully on the counter. "I don't know what her game is," Jedediah said, and his voice was careful and even, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "But she's been lying to me from the first day." "What do you want to do about it?" Walt said. "I don't know yet," Jedediah said. Ada stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the counter and the smell of blackberry preserves in the air, and understood that she had approximately 1 evening to decide what to do, because the moment Jedediah confronted her, which he would, she would have no ground left to stand on at all. She could leave. She could be gone before supper, take her bag and her box and walk down to the road and flag the next wagon headed toward Laramie. She had done it before, moved before the moment of exposure, and she was good at it. She did not move. She thought about the gray mare in the corral, and what Jedediah had said about teaching something terrified that the world could also be gentle, and you give her enough time with the gentle version that it starts to outweigh the memory of the other kind. She thought about Missouri and who she had been there. She made supper. She made it carefully, the best meal she had made in the 5 weeks she had been at Keating Ranch, roasted meat and good bread and the preserved peaches she had been saving. She set it on the table and she sat at her end and she waited. Jedediah came in and looked at the table and looked at her, and she saw that he already knew she had heard. He was not a man who could entirely conceal his awareness, not from someone who watched as carefully as she did. They ate. It was the most excruciating meal of Ada Blackwell's adult life, which covered some considerable competition. Neither of them spoke about anything real. Jedediah asked about the accounts. Ada told him. He mentioned that the south fence needed mending before the hard weather. She said she had noticed. When the meal was done and she had cleared the plates, she came back to the table and sat down and looked at him directly. "I think you know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you didn't come from the agency," he said. "I know the letter was forged. I know you have been in this house under false pretenses." He paused. "I do not know why." "If I told you why," Ada said, "you might not believe it because it is not a simple story and it does not reflect well on me." "I would prefer the truth to the performance," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. She told him about Harlan Cruz, and she started at the beginning because he deserved the beginning. She told him about the dinner in Kansas City in 1873, when she was 17, and her father had introduced her to a man he said was a good man, a successful man, a man who might be worth knowing. She told him about the 2 years that followed, when Cruz had made himself indispensable to her father's struggling business, and then, when her father died in 1875, leaving debts that Cruz held, she understood for the first time what the acquisition had always been about. Cruz did not want her. He wanted the land her father had left her, a parcel of good bottom ground in Missouri that was worth more than her father had realized. She had refused to sign the deed over. She had refused everything Cruz asked of her. He had other methods. She told Jedediah about the 3 years of systematic destruction that followed, the employment references Cruz had poisoned, the rumors he had spread with the particular care of a man who understood exactly how to damage a woman's reputation without leaving fingerprints on the knife. She had moved from Kansas City to St. Louis to Omaha to Denver to Cheyenne, always finding work, always being careful, always eventually finding that Cruz's reach was longer than she had run. "In Cheyenne," she said, "I found the agency by accident. Mrs. Caldwell gave me work as a clerk. I thought I had found something stable, something that might last. Then I saw Doyle on the street, Cruz's man. And you took the first option you could find," Jedediah said. "I took your file," she said. "I read your letter." "You sounded like..." She stopped. "Like what?" His voice was very quiet. "Like someone I could trust," she said, "not to abuse it. I thought if I could stay long enough for Doyle to lose the scent, I would leave before the 6 weeks were up and no harm would be done." "No harm," he repeated. "I know how it sounds," she said. "It sounds like you have been running for 7 years," he said. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected anger or judgment or the cold dismissal that came from a man who felt he had been made a fool of. She had not expected him to look at her with something that was dangerously close to grief. "I have been running for 7 years," she said. "Do you have proof of what Cruz has done?" he asked. "A letter," she said, "written in his own hand to a man named Partridge in St. Louis about an arrangement they made to damage my ability to earn a living. And there may be worse than that in it. Mrs. Ortega in Cheyenne has it. And Cruz doesn't know about the letter. No one knows about it except me and Mrs. Ortega." Jedediah was quiet for a long moment. He had his hands flat on the table, the same way she had stood in the kitchen that afternoon, and he was looking at them with the focused attention of a man deciding something that could not be undecided once it was made. "The arrangement you came here under," he said slowly. "What were your intentions when the 6 weeks were up?" "To leave," she said honestly, "to find somewhere else." "And now?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. The honest answer was complicated in ways she did not have the right to make complicated, because she had entered his house through a door she had picked the lock on, and she could not now stand inside it and claim the right to complicated feelings. "I don't know," she said. He nodded slowly. He stood up from the table and carried his cup to the kitchen and set it in the basin. Then he came back to the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor and stood there for a moment. "You will stay the night," he said. "We will talk more tomorrow." She was not sure what she had expected. Dismissal, probably. Not this. "All right," she said. He went upstairs. She sat in the parlor for a long time in the dark with the cold, preserved peaches in their jar on the table and the accounts ledger open to the last page she had worked, and the sound of the ranch settling around her in the night, the particular sounds of this particular place that she had learned over 5 weeks without realizing she was learning them. She went to bed eventually, though she did not sleep much. In the morning, Jedediah was at breakfast before her, which was unusual since she was normally the first one in the kitchen. He had made coffee, which was also unusual, and he had made it correctly, which surprised her slightly because in 5 weeks she had seen no evidence that he paid any attention to the process. He poured her a cup and set it in front of her and sat down across from her. "I have been thinking," he said. "I imagined," she said. "The arrangement as it stands is not workable," he said. "Not because you have been dishonest with me about how you came here, but because you are still in danger, and I will not have a woman in danger on my land and do nothing about it." Ada felt something tighten in her chest that was neither comfortable nor entirely unpleasant. "You said it was my land," she started, meaning to say that it was not his problem. "It is my land," he said, "and you are on it, and that makes it my concern." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "What I am proposing," he continued, "is that we contact the territorial marshal's office, that we get the letter from Mrs. Ortega, that we make a formal complaint about Harlan Cruz and his man Doyle, and we pursue it properly." "And if Cruz gets to the marshal first," Ada said. "He has money and connections. He has been doing this for 7 years and no one has stopped him." "He has not been dealing with me before," Jedediah said. There was no arrogance in it. He said it the same way he said everything, flatly and with the weight of a man who meant exactly what he said. Ada looked at him across the table in the early morning light and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the particular terrifying sensation of believing that someone might actually be capable of what they were claiming. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "I deceived you. I came here under false pretenses. You owe me nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, because what has been done to you is wrong," he said simply, "and because I think you know that already but no one with the means to act on it has been in a position to tell you." Ada looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen window where the early morning light was coming through clear and golden. She thought about Missouri and who she had been there and the woman she had been for the 7 years since. "What would it mean," she said carefully, "for the arrangement if we pursue this?" "The arrangement was always about what was practical," he said. "That hasn't changed. You are useful here, Miss Blackwell, more useful than I expected." A pause. "And I find that I would prefer you not to leave." It was, she thought, the most careful admission she had ever heard from anyone. "I will stay until the matter is resolved," she said, "and then we will see." He nodded. He stood. "I'll write to the marshal's office today." He did. The next week was a strange one, a week of waiting and of the peculiar intimacy that comes from two people who have dropped a pretense and must decide what to replace it with. Ada was more herself, or closer to it, than she had been since her arrival. The careful performance of the forged letter was gone. What remained was simply Ada Blackwell, which was sharper and more complicated but also, she thought, more honest. She and Jedediah talked more in that week than they had in the entire previous 5 combined. Not always about important things, sometimes about the most ordinary things possible, about the cattle and the winter preparations, and the mending that needed doing on the tack shed roof. But sometimes about the things that mattered. He told her about his father, Caleb Keating, who had built the ranch from a land grant in 1859 when Wyoming was still a territory, and the land itself was new in the way that land can only be new once. Caleb had been a hard man, not cruel but inflexible, the kind of man who built things through sheer will and left no room for anything softer than necessity. Jedediah had grown up knowing how to work but not always knowing what the work was for, and when his father died in 1876 and left the ranch to him, he had spent 2 years learning how to be the kind of man who owned something rather than simply maintained it. "Is that why you wrote to the agency?" Ada asked one evening over the account books. He was quiet for a long moment. "I wrote because I am 32 years old and I am tired of this house being empty," he said. It was the most personal thing she had heard him say, and she thought it cost him something to say it. "It hasn't been empty," she said. "You have Walt and Refugio and Pitch." "That is not the same kind of empty," he said. She looked at the numbers in front of her and thought about what he meant, because she knew perfectly well what he meant, and the knowing of it was deeply inconvenient given her situation. "No," she agreed. "It's not." On the 14th day after Jedediah wrote to the marshal's office, a deputy marshal named Teague came to the ranch. He was a youngish man, pragmatic and overworked, and he listened to what Jedediah told him with the careful attention of someone who was weighing whether this was worth his time. When Jedediah laid the facts out, the 7 years of documented interference, the letter in Cheyenne, the specific accusations that could be backed by witnesses in 2 states, Teague's expression shifted from politely skeptical to genuinely interested. Ada told her part of it directly. She had done this before, reported Cruz before, twice, in Kansas City and in Denver, and been turned away both times because Cruz had been there first and she was alone. She told Teague this without bitterness, just as information he needed in order to understand the shape of what he was dealing with. Teague looked at her steadily when she had finished. "This man Cruz," he said. "He operates out of Kansas City, primarily," Ada said, "though his interests reach into the territory." "I know the name," Teague said, which surprised her. "He has been of interest before, not for this, for land dealings that had some questions about them." He paused. "If you have that letter, Miss Blackwell, and if it says what you say it says, that is material evidence." "It does," she said, "and I can get it." Jedediah had already arranged for a message to be sent to Mrs. Ortega in Cheyenne, through a man he knew who was making the trip within the week. The message was careful and specific. Mrs. Ortega, who was a woman of iron reliability, would send the letter back by the same messenger. It took 11 days. 11 days during which Ada kept the accounts and made the meals and worked on the preparations for winter, and in the evening sat in the parlor with Jedediah Keating reading his Milton and something happening between them that was slow and quiet and entirely inevitable. The way water works on stone, not dramatic but absolutely persistent. She was reading one of his books, A History of the Territory, sitting in the chair across from his by the small stove, and he was watching her more than he was reading his own book, and she was aware of it and was doing her own watching when she thought he was absorbed. They were both, she thought, very careful people who had learned that carefulness was the price of survival, and the carefulness was making something simple into something extraordinarily complicated. On the 9th of those 11 days, the gray mare in the corral did something that had not happened since she arrived. She came to Jedediah's hand willingly, with her head low and her eyes soft, and he stood with his hand on her neck and something so quiet and relieved in his face that Ada, watching from the fence, felt the specific feeling of witnessing a private moment and knew she should look away and could not quite make herself do it. He looked up and saw her. He did not ask her to leave. He held out his other hand toward the fence, not quite a gesture, not quite an invitation, something between the two. She climbed through the fence rails and walked to him, and she put her hand on the mare's neck beside his, and the mare's skin shivered once and then went still, accepting it. They stood like that for a long moment, their hands not touching, just close, with the mare between them and the October sky enormous overhead, and Ada thought that if she were a different woman in a different situation she might have turned to him and said something honest. But she was the woman she was, and the situation was what it was, and so she simply stood and let the moment be what it was and did not ruin it with words. The letter from Mrs. Ortega arrived on the 12th day. It was better than Ada remembered. Harlan Cruz, in his own hand, laid out not only his interference with Ada's employment in explicit terms, describing it as necessary to prevent her from establishing independence that would allow her to contest his claim to the Missouri land, but also referenced a previous arrangement with a Judge Partridge in St. Louis that had involved the suppression of a fraud complaint filed by a widow named Calhoun, whose assets had been folded into Cruz's holdings after her husband's death in ways that were. Cruz suggested to Partridge with cheerful openness, advantageous to both of them. Teague, when the letter reached him through Jedediah, sent a wire to the territorial marshal the same day. It took 3 weeks, but at the end of those 3 weeks, Harlan Cruz was under investigation by the territorial marshal's office in Wyoming and the federal circuit court in Missouri, with the Calhoun letter having drawn the attention of additional parties. His man Doyle left Cheyenne so fast he apparently left half his belongings at his boarding house. Mrs. Ortega sent a second letter to Ada, this one personal. It said, "I always knew you had the right of it, Ada. Stay somewhere good this time." Ada read this letter sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, and she sat with it in her hands for a long time. The 6 weeks of the original arrangement had passed. They had passed quietly, absorbed by everything else without either of them remarking on it. She had not gone anywhere. She was aware that this was a thing that needed to be addressed. The original terms had been clear: 6 weeks and then a decision. They had not discussed it because the weeks had been filled with the Cruz situation, but the weeks were over now, and Cruz was no longer an immediate threat, and Ada had no clear reason to stay at Keating Ranch except the true reason, which she was still not sure she was prepared to say out loud. She thought about what she would do if she left. She could go back to Cheyenne, Mrs. Caldwell had said once that she could come back to the agency if things changed. She could go to Laramie or further. She was good at finding work. She had proven that repeatedly. She sat in the kitchen and thought about this very practically and did not feel practical at all. That evening, Jedediah came in from the south pasture later than usual because the fence mending had taken longer than expected. And she had kept his supper warm and he ate it standing by the stove because he was still in his work coat, and his boots were muddy, and he did not want to track through the kitchen. She watched him eat standing up in his work clothes and felt something so warm and specific in her chest that it frightened her slightly. After he ate, he looked at the letter on the table, Mrs. Ortega's letter. Ada had left it there. "Good news," he said. "She said to stay somewhere good," Ada said. He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that she had been learning to read for 6 weeks. "Are you planning to?" "I don't know," she said. "You could," he said. His voice was very careful. "If you wanted to." "Wanting something and knowing what to do about it are different things," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other across the warm kitchen, and something enormous and unsaid filled all the space between them, and neither of them had the words for it yet, or the courage, quite, for the words. It was another 2 days before the conversation they needed to have actually happened, and it happened badly, as the most important conversations often do, starting from the wrong end and going sideways before it went anywhere useful. It started because of Walt Greer, of all people. Walt, who had watched Ada for 6 weeks with his careful assessing eyes, came to find her in the kitchen on a Friday afternoon, while Jedediah was out checking on the cattle in the upper pasture. Walt stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which was something she had never seen him do before, and said, "I want to say something if you'll let me." "Say it," Ada said. "I've been with Jed's family since before Jed was born," Walt said. "I was here when his mother left, and I was here when his father died, and I have watched that man work this land for 11 years since then without asking for a single thing that wasn't practical and necessary." He paused. "He asked for you," Walt said. "Not you specifically, but he asked for a woman to be here. And in all the time I've known him, I have never seen him ask for something he actually wanted. Just things he needed." Ada turned from the stove to look at him. "He is not a man who shows things easily," Walt said. "His father didn't either. It's not a thing they were taught to do. But I am old enough to see what I'm looking at, and what I'm looking at is a man who is going to watch you walk out that gate and consider it a fact of life and probably not recover from it." Ada said nothing. Walt put his hat back on. "That's all I wanted to say," he said, and went back out. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, and then she did something she had not done in years. She made a decision not from fear or necessity or strategy, but from the simple, terrifying honesty of what she actually wanted. She wanted to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because Cruz was still a threat, because he was not immediately. Not because the work needed her, though it did. But because this house, this difficult, quiet man, this land that ran its winters hard and its summers gold, had become something she did not have a word for yet, but that felt, when she was honest with herself in the dark of her room at the top of the stairs, like the thing she had been running toward without knowing it. All those 7 years she had thought she was running away. She wanted to stay. She waited for Jedediah to come back from the upper pasture, and when he came in, she was standing in the parlor doorway instead of the kitchen, which was different enough from the usual pattern that he stopped and looked at her. "I need to say something," she said. "All right," he said. She had planned what to say. She had arranged it carefully in her mind while she waited, the way she arranged everything she needed to do correctly. And then she opened her mouth and all of it fell apart, and what came out instead was, "I would like to stay, not because of the arrangement, not because of Cruz. I would like to stay because this is the first place in 7 years that has felt like it could be mine, and I know that is a great deal to say to someone I forged a letter to, but I have run out of ability to be dishonest about it, and so there it is." Jedediah Keating stood very still. "That is not a small thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I am aware of that. I am not comfortable with a great many things that come easily to other people. I work hard and I am not always present, and I say less than I mean, and I mean more than most people understand." "I know," she said. "I also," he said, and stopped, and she could see him working at it, working at the words the way he worked at the horses, carefully and without forcing it. "I also would like you to stay, for reasons that are considerably past practical." Ada felt something inside her chest do something she could only describe as opening, the specific sensation of a door swinging wide in a room that had been closed for a very long time. "Past practical," she repeated. "I have been trying to find the appropriate moment to say so for approximately 3 weeks," he said, with the kind of dry acknowledgement of his own difficulty that she found unbearably endearing. The appropriate moment kept failing to present itself. "It didn't present itself," she said. "It is being forced into existence by a woman who has finally decided to stop being careful." Something shifted in his face then, something that broke through all the careful composure and came out as the most genuine expression she had seen from him. Something warm and almost helpless. The expression of a man who has been trying very hard to be what the situation required, and has been suddenly given permission to be what he actually was. He closed the distance between them, slowly, in the way he did everything, and she met him halfway, which was something she had not done in 7 years, and he put his hands on her face with the same careful attentiveness he used for everything that mattered to him, and she thought again of what he had said about the gray mare. "You teach her that the world can also be gentle." And the gentleness of him was so immediate, and so exactly what she had not known. She needed that her eyes went hot with something she refused to call crying. He did not kiss her immediately. He stood with his hands on her face and looked at her, and she let herself be looked at, which was also something she had not done in a very long time. "Ada," he said, just her name, the way he had not said it before, without without the professional distance she had maintained like a fence. "Jedediah," she said. He kissed her. It was not the tentative, cautious kiss of two people who did not know each other. They knew each other very well. It was the kiss of two people who had been saying things without words for 6 weeks, and were finally saying them in the most direct language available. And it was warm and honest and thorough. And when it was done, Ada Blackwell stood in the parlor of Keating Ranch with her hands in Jedediah Keating's coat lapels and her forehead against his, and felt, for the first time in 7 years, that she was standing on solid ground. They talked for a very long time that evening. Not about the arrangement, which was no longer the correct word for anything. They talked about the future, which was also a thing Ada had not permitted herself to do in a very long time. They talked about the ranch, about the plans Jedediah had for the upper pasture, about the second story of the house that needed proper windows before another winter. They talked about Missouri and about what it meant to build something from nothing in a difficult landscape and whether it was worth it, and both of them knew without saying it that they were not only talking about the ranch. They talked about the gray mare, who Jedediah had decided to keep. Ada said the mare needed a name. Jedediah said that was Ada's privilege since she was the one who had taken an interest. Ada thought about it and said, "Patience." He smiled at that. It was the fullest smile she had seen from him, reaching both corners of his face and the corners of his eyes, and it changed his whole face into something that was almost boyish in its openness. And Ada tucked that smile away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered and knew she would keep it there for a very long time. Jedediah spoke to the justice of the peace in Rattlesnake Creek Township the following week, and they were married on the last Saturday of October 1882 with Walt and Refugio, and Pitch as witnesses and Mrs. Teague, the deputy marshal's wife who had taken a shine to Ada at a brief meeting in town, as the closest thing to a female relation present. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Neither of them wanted elaborate. They stood in the cool October afternoon outside the justice's office and said what needed to be said and signed what needed to be signed, and Jedediah took her hand when it was done and held it with the specific, careful attention he gave to everything he decided to keep. Walt cried, which he denied absolutely afterward, and no one mentioned again. The winter that followed was the hardest one Ada had experienced since Missouri, which was saying something. The snows came early and heavy, the kind that Wyoming produced when it was serious about winter, and the ranch contracted inward to its essential functions. The cattle were moved to the shelter pasture. The hands worked the barn and the fences and the feeding in rotations. The house was warm because Ada had spent all of October making sure it would be, laying in stores with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had lived through poverty and knew what insufficient preparation looked like. She and Jedediah were, in the long winter months, confined to each other's company more consistently than the summer and fall had allowed, and what this revealed was both what she had expected and nothing like what she had expected. He was quiet, but the quality of his quiet was not lonely anymore. He was present, in the particular way of a man who has decided something and committed to it entirely. He was funny, which she had not suspected and which delighted her, in a dry and completely deadpan way that caught her off guard the first several times. He read to her in the evenings, from the Milton, and from a novel she found in a box of things he had stored upstairs, a Dickens that she had read twice in Missouri and loved, and there was something about hearing words she knew read in a voice that was becoming the most familiar sound in her world that made everything feel settled in a way she had never been settled before. She kept the accounts. She expanded the kitchen garden plans for spring, ordering seeds from a catalog out of Denver. She began teaching Refugio to read, which he had asked her for shyly, and which she did with such matter-of-fact directness that he immediately stopped being embarrassed about it. Refugio was earnest and quick, and took to the letters with the focused determination of someone who understood exactly why the skill was valuable. In February, the worst storm of the winter trapped everyone on the property for 11 days. The snow was past the first fence rail. The cattle huddled in the shelter pasture, and the men worked in shifts to keep them from drifting. Jedediah was out in it more than was good for him, and Ada, for the first time, felt the specific fear of a woman whose husband's work put him in the kind of danger that could not be entirely managed. She did not tell him to be less careful about the cattle. She knew what the cattle meant, and she knew what the ranch meant, and she knew that asking a working man to be less than he was for the sake of her anxiety was the wrong kind of love. Instead, she made sure there was always something warm ready when he came in, and she watched the storm from the kitchen window with the calm, deliberate attention of a woman who has decided to stop running and must therefore find a way to stand still even when it is difficult. On the 6th day of the storm, Jedediah came in from the night shift looking exhausted in a way that went past physical, the kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained vigilance in punishing conditions. And Ada brought him to the kitchen and made him sit while she pulled his boots off and put dry stockings on him with the practical efficiency of someone who knew how to take care of things. And he sat through all of it with the slightly bewildered look of a man who was not accustomed to being taken care of. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "I am capable of managing my own boots," he said. "I am aware of that," she said. "That is not the point." He looked at her while she worked, and the expression on his face was the one she was starting to identify as the thing he wore when something moved him deeply and he did not have the words for it yet. "Ada," he said. "Drink your coffee," she said. "It's hot." He drank his coffee. He watched her over the rim of the cup. The storm howled against the windows. "I am very glad you stayed," he said. She looked at him from across the kitchen. "You asked me to," she said. "You didn't answer," he said. "No," she said, "but I didn't leave." He set the cup down and reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him hold it. And outside the storm worked at the windows, and inside the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and Ada Blackwell, who had been running for 7 years, sat in her kitchen in her home and was still. The storm broke on the 11th day. They lost 4 cattle, which was fewer than Jedediah had feared and more than he liked. Walt said it was a miracle the number was that low, and Pitch agreed with unusual solemnity. And Refugio, who was becoming something of a fixture at the kitchen table for his reading lessons, made the sign of the cross and said that the Lord had been attentive. Spring came the way Wyoming spring always came, without apology and with a great deal of mud. The cattle moved back to the pastures. The fence mending season began. The kitchen garden was planted according to Ada's catalog plans, and it was larger than it had ever been, laid out with the kind of organized intention that comes from someone who expects to be doing this for a long time and wants it done right. In April, Jedediah came home from a trip to Rattlesnake Creek to sell cattle at the spring market with a length of dark blue wool fabric folded in his saddlebag. "There was a dry goods order come in," he said, setting it on the kitchen table. "I thought you might want some new material." Ada looked at the fabric. She looked at him. "You picked this out yourself," she said. It was not a question. The blue was exactly the right shade, the particular dark blue that she had mentioned once, in passing, in the context of something else entirely, as the color she liked best. "I thought the color suited you," he said, and then turned to hang up his coat with a studiousness that suggested he did not want to see whatever was on her face at that moment. She made the fabric into a dress that she wore on Sundays, and felt every time she put it on, as though she were carrying something warm and specific. It was in June that she understood she was expecting a child. She was not entirely surprised. She was not entirely anything. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days, testing it, making sure of it, running through what it meant with the practical side of her mind that was always the first to function. What it meant was that this was real. What it meant was that she had stopped being temporary here, somewhere between October and February, without noticing the exact moment, and what she was building in this house with this man was permanent in the way that only certain things are permitted to be. She told Jedediah on a Thursday evening. She told him directly because directness was the policy they had settled into and she had no desire to change it. He went very still. Then he set down the book he had been reading and looked at her with the full, undivided attention she had come to know as his version of great feeling. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. "It's early yet." "Are you?" He stopped. He was working at something again. She could see the effort. "Are you glad?" he asked. She thought about Missouri and her mother, and the particular quality of January sunlight through that kitchen window. She thought about 7 years of running, and what it meant to have arrived somewhere worth arriving at. "I am very glad," she said. He crossed the room and took her in his arms with the same careful attention he gave to everything he considered worth protecting, and she put her head against his shoulder and felt the solidity of him, and thought that she had been afraid of exactly this, being held, being somewhere, being someone who had something to lose, and that the fear was so much smaller than the reality of it. "I will build the new windows on the second floor this summer," he said into her hair. "Before the cold comes." She laughed, which was not what he expected, and he pulled back to look at her with a slightly uncertain expression, and she laughed harder. "You are building windows," she said. "The upstairs needs proper windows before winter," he said, defensive in his logical Jedediah way. "Yes," she said, still smiling. "Build them." He built them. Over the summer, he built proper insulated windows on the second floor of the house, and expanded the stable, and fixed the south fence comprehensively enough that Walt declared it would probably outlast all of them. And in the evenings, he came in muddy and tired, and satisfied in the way of a man who is building something that will last. And Ada kept the accounts, and the kitchen, and watched the garden come up in rows, and thought that this was what it felt like when the thing you had been running toward finally stopped moving, so you could catch up to it. Walt, in August, took Ada aside in the kitchen and told her that she had done something that none of the rest of them had managed to do, including himself, in 11 years. "What's that?" she said. "Made him stop being careful about his happiness," Walt said. "He was treating his own happiness like something that might break if he handled it directly. You made him just pick it up." Ada thought about the gray mare and patience, and what it meant to let something terrified learn that the world could also be gentle. "He did that himself," she said. "He did it with considerable assistance," Walt said, and went back out before she could argue with him. In late August, Refugio received a letter from his family in Texas. He read it himself, which was the first letter he had read without help, and he came to show Ada with a kind of dignified pride that made her throat go tight. He read it aloud to her slowly, and she listened with her hands folded in her lap, and felt the particular satisfaction of having given something that could not be taken back. The baby was born in February of 1884, in the second winter, which was milder than the first. Jedediah was in the house for all of it, because he had not intended to be elsewhere, and because Ada had not asked him to be elsewhere, and because they had settled, over the course of the previous year, into the particular kind of partnership that is only built in increments, through shared difficulty and shared good things, and the patient daily work of being honest with another person. The baby was a boy. He was born in the early morning with a great deal of vocal objection to the proceedings, which Ada found reassuring. She had been afraid in the abstract way of a woman who has learned not to count on things staying well. But the moment the boy was in her arms, that particular fear dissolved into something so immediate and physical that there was no room for abstraction. Jedediah stood next to the bed and looked at his son with the same expression he wore when something moved him beyond words, and Ada watched him find his way to the appropriate response and felt so much love for him in that moment that it was almost too large to contain. "He's loud," Jedediah said. "Good," Ada said. "He is perfect," Jedediah said more quietly. "Yes," Ada said. They named him Caleb, for Jedediah's father, which Jedediah had suggested with a careful casualness that did not fool Ada at all. The name was important to him in complicated ways that had to do with the ranch and with inheritance, and with the particular business of becoming the kind of man your father was not, while still honoring what your father built. Ada thought it was the right name. She also thought it would do Caleb Keating no harm to have a complicated, layered inheritance to make sense of. Walt, when he was allowed in to see the boy, was reduced to silence for approximately 2 full minutes, which was the longest Ada had ever seen him go without saying anything. Pitch said, "Huh. Looks like a Keating." Refugio said, "He is beautiful, Ada." And she believed him because Refugio always meant exactly what he said. The winter of 1884 turned soft, and the spring came early, and the ranch went into the year with more cattle than the previous year and fewer losses, and the south fence holding completely. Ada planted the kitchen garden even larger and added a section for herbs that she had wanted from the beginning. Jedediah hired a fourth hand, a quiet young man named Amos Birch who was looking for steady work, and whom Walt approved of after a week of assessing silence. There was no dramatic resolution to things, because the truth of most lives is that the dramas, when they are resolved, give way to the texture of everyday existence, which is not less meaningful for being quieter. The investigation into Harlan Cruz had proceeded through the territorial courts for the better part of a year, complicated and slow, as legal proceedings in that era always were. The final outcome, which came to Jedediah by letter in the spring of 1884, was that Cruz had entered a settlement of considerable civil liability in the matter of the widow Calhoun's estate, and that the criminal inquiry into the fraud was proceeding. He had not been in Wyoming territory since Doyle's departure, and Ada had reason to believe he would not be coming. She read the letter and felt something she had been carrying since she was 19 years old set down, quietly and without ceremony, somewhere she no longer had to carry it. The land in Missouri, her father's land, was part of the settlement. She would not be going back to claim it, not with Keating Ranch under her feet and Caleb in his cradle upstairs and the accounts in her handwriting on the desk in the study. But it meant something to have it restored, to have the theft named and at least partially acknowledged. She showed Jedediah the letter. He read it and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything in this house, in this marriage, where honesty had become not just a policy but a practice. "Like it's over," she said. "Like I can stop waiting for it to not be." "Good," he said, and reached across and took her hand in his, the same way he had in the kitchen during the storm, with the specific careful attention of a man who knows the value of what he is holding. She turned her hand over and held his back. The summer of 1884 was a good one. The cattle did well. The kitchen garden was abundant enough that Ada began selling the excess in town, which added a modest but meaningful income to the ranch's accounts, and which also introduced Ada to the women of Rattlesnake Creek Township in a way that her previous visits had not. She developed a particular friendship with a woman named Helen Marsh, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and who was blunt and funny, and had strong opinions about everything, which Ada found deeply refreshing. Caleb, by summer, was making himself understood about his opinions on food and weather and the general arrangement of his surroundings. He had Jedediah's eyes, that light, considering color that caught the sun, and he had Ada's stubborn expressiveness, and the combination made him, in Walt's assessment, a child who was going to be considerable trouble and considerable joy in roughly equal measure. Jedediah with Caleb was something Ada watched whenever she could without being too obvious about it. He was not naturally demonstrative in the easy ways, the casual words and small gestures that some fathers seem to have ready at hand. But he was present. He was thoroughly, completely present in the way that was, Ada had learned over the course of their marriage, his deepest form of love. He was there, and paying attention, and learning the boy with the same patient, careful attentiveness he had used to learn everything else that mattered to him. On a Sunday afternoon in August, Ada came around the side of the house looking for Caleb, who had grown mobile enough to require consistent awareness of his location, and found him in the corral with Jedediah and Patience the gray mare. Jedediah was holding the boy up to touch the mare's neck, and Patience, who was 4 years on from the damage of her previous life and had become genuinely gentle, stood still and let the small hand touch her. Caleb was silent in the specific, enormous-eyed way of a child encountering something magnificent for the first time. Ada stopped at the fence. "Soft," Jedediah was saying to the boy. "You have to be soft with her." Caleb's small hand patted. The mare's ear flickered. Caleb made a sound that was clearly wonder, a low, reverent sound, and Jedediah laughed, and Ada stood at the fence and felt something so complete that she understood for the first time what people meant when they said they were full. She was full. Of this, of these two, of this land and this life, and the particular quality of August afternoon light in Wyoming that was not like any other light anywhere. She would have stood there longer, but Caleb, catching sight of her, immediately made clear his opinion that she should come over here and experience the horse too, and she climbed through the fence rails the same way she had the first time, a year and some months ago, and walked to where her husband and her son were standing with the patient, gentle mare. Jedediah put his free arm around her, and she leaned into his side with her head against his shoulder, and she thought, "Here, this is the place." After all the running, after all the years of strategic movement and careful distance, and doors held open for a fast exit, here was the thing she had been moving toward without knowing what it was called. She had stopped moving. She had not left. A year after Caleb was born, Ada found herself expecting again, which she told Jedediah with considerably less ceremony than the first time, because they had both learned that ceremony was not required when the thing itself was already so full of meaning. He took the news with the same steady, fully present attention and said that they would need to expand the upstairs, and she said she had already been thinking about it. And he looked at her with a smile that started at the corner of his mouth and traveled slowly across his whole face. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1885, when the prairie was just beginning to think about being green again. They named her Me, which had been Ada's mother's name, and she arrived in the world considerably quieter than Caleb had managed, with a focused, watchful expression that was, Jedediah said, entirely her mother's. "She is watching everything," he said, looking at the baby. "She is learning the room," Ada said. "She is being careful." "She will not need to be," Jedediah said. Ada looked at him. There was something in his voice that was not just about the baby, but about everything, about the particular world they were building here on 1,200 acres of Wyoming land, where the winters were hard and the summers were gold and the work was constant and the house was warm and nobody inside it was running from anything anymore. "No," Ada said. "She will not." Walt was 47 that spring and had slowed down some, enough that Jedediah had quietly adjusted his work to the things that were easier on his knees, which Walt accepted with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite protest, and was exactly what you would expect from a man who had been working hard since he was old enough to hold a tool and did not know how to be anything else. Refugio had learned to write as well as he read by then, and on the occasion of Me's birth, he wrote a letter to his family in Texas telling them about it, and showed it to Ada before he sent it. She read it and said it was well written and meant it. Life at Keating Ranch settled into the rhythms that are the real substance of a good life, the seasonal ones of cattle and harvest and winter preparation, and the daily ones of meals and accounts and children learning what the world was. Ada kept the books with the thoroughness she had always brought to them, and the books showed a ranch that was consistently profitable and carefully managed, expanding in the modest, deliberate way of a thing that is being built to last rather than to impress. In 1886, when Caleb was 2 and Me was 1, Jedediah bought the parcel of land adjacent to the north fence from a rancher who was retiring to Missouri, which Ada found privately amusing. The parcel brought the ranch to just over 1,500 acres and added a stretch of good creek bottom that Jedediah had been watching for years. He showed her the deed that evening after the children were in bed. "North section," he said, spreading the survey paper on the table. "This creek bottom here, that is good hay ground. If we put it in timothy and clover this spring, it will carry us through the next hard winter without buying feed." She looked at the survey. She looked at him, bent over the table in the lamplight with the same focused attention he gave to everything that was part of the ranch's future, the future he was building not just for himself but for Caleb and Me and whatever came after them. "Your father would have wanted this parcel," Ada said. Jedediah was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "He tried for it once." "Now you have it," she said. He looked up at her. The lamp caught his face from below, and she saw in it the particular mixture of things she had come to know very well in the years of their marriage, the reserve and the warmth and the dry, careful humor, and the depth of feeling that he had been learning, slowly and with considerable effort, to let be visible. "We have it," he said. She put her hand over the deed, over the surveyed lines of this land that was hers as much as his, that bore their shared name and their shared work and would someday carry the names of their children and their children's children. "We have it," she agreed. In the autumn of 1886, when the leaves were turning in the cottonwoods along Keating Creek and the cattle were fat from the summer grass, and the hay was in, and the kitchen garden had yielded more than they could use, and Ada had spent 3 days making preserves with Helen Marsh's help, and the house smelled of fruit and sugar and warm canning jars. Ada Blackwell Keating sat on the front porch in the late afternoon light and held me on her lap and watched Caleb follow Jedediah around the yard with the specific, focused imitation of a small child who has decided that the most important thing in the world is to do exactly what his father does. Jedediah, who was mending a piece of harness on the porch steps, was aware of being followed and was pretending he wasn't, which was the most purely amusing thing Ada had ever seen from him. Every few minutes Caleb would reach out and try to help with the harness, and Jedediah would find some small piece of the task to hand over, and Caleb would work on it with enormous seriousness. Walt came out of the barn and leaned on the fence and watched the scene on the porch with the expression of a man cataloging something he intends to remember, and caught Ada's eye and nodded, once, in the particular shorthand they had developed over the years. She nodded back. Me made a sound of decisive opinion about something, and Ada looked down at her daughter's face, dark-haired and watchful, and exactly as Jedediah had said she would be, careful, taking in the room, learning everything. She looked like Ada's mother a little in the shape of her brow, and the recognition of it was a sweetness that had no bitterness in it at all. "What do you see?" Ada said to the baby, who was looking out at the yard with great interest. Me pointed at Caleb and then at Jedediah with an authority that suggested she was identifying the relevant parties. "That's right," Ada said. "Your father and your brother." She said it simply, as a fact. Not with the wondering disbelief of someone who has acquired something they did not expect to keep, just a fact. The way you state the year of the ranch, the name of the creek, the count of the cattle in the lower pasture, her husband and her son, her daughter in her arms, her name on the account books, her kitchen, her garden, her land, her life. Hers. Jedediah looked up from the harness and across the yard at her, and she looked back at him, and the October afternoon light turned the cottonwoods along the creek gold, and the mountains to the east went blue, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around them. And Jedediah Keating, who was not a man who said things easily, looked at his wife on the porch with his daughter in her lap and said nothing at all. He did not look away. And she said nothing either, but she did not leave. She would not leave. She had stopped leaving. She had made her decision in a gateway in the last light of an October evening, when a proud, careful man had said one word to her in a voice that had nothing to do with pride at all, and she had stood still, and the silence between them had filled with everything that came after. Everything that was still coming. All the winters and springs, and the children growing, and the land expanding under their shared intention, and the account books, and the gray mare growing old and gentle in the corral, and Walt's knees getting worse, and Refugio writing letters home in his own hand, and the particular sound of Jedediah reading aloud by the stove in January, and the way the ranch sat in the Wyoming landscape like something that had always been there, patient and particular and real. Here was the whole of it. Here was the place where Ada Blackwell had stopped running and found out what she had been running toward. Here was where the proud rancher had asked her to stay on his land, and she had said nothing, and she had not left, and the not leaving had been the beginning of absolutely everything.